Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Jeffrey Smith. He is the founder of the Institute for Responsible Technology, and he is the author of the book, Seeds of Deception, Exposing Industry and Government Lies About the Safety of Genetically Engineered Foods That We're Eating. He is the author of Genetic Roulette, The Documented Health Risks of Genetically Engineered Foods. I have to say, of all of the subjects that I've covered and am deeply concerned about, genetically modified food is one of the most important subjects that anybody should be listening to aside from what's in our water. I am deeply concerned about what the population is eating, the stronghold that Monsanto has over the FDA, and how the FDA and the EPA are complicit in bringing us these toxic, poisonous foods that are destroying our food supply. But let me say no more. Jeffrey Smith, you should be getting the Nobel Prize. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Jeffrey Smith to It's Rainmaking Time.
Thank you, Kim. Great to be here.
I'm very disturbed by what I've learned in Seeds of Deception, mostly because these seeds and these foods are already created in our food supply, in the international food supply, and I want to know if you can explain what a promoter is and the basic paradigm on genes.
Great. In our DNA, we have a whole symphony that's being controlled. Certain genes are being turned on and off according to the needs of the cell. And each cell has its own promoter or on switch, which turns it on. Now, with genetic engineering, you take genes from one species and you force it into the DNA of another species that would never naturally contain those genes. And you have to force those genes on by putting in your own promoter, typically from a virus, and that turns the gene on 24/7 at high volume, and it completely ignores the needs of the cell because we don't understand the language of the DNA. And so we stick in these genes, we stick in the promoter which turns it on, and it causes these genes to produce large amounts of new proteins, and these proteins can have effects on health, they can influence other metabolic pathways, and not only that, but the process of inserting the gene, which is typically done through a gene gun or bacterial infection, as well as cloning the cell into a GM plant, causes massive collateral damage in the DNA and can cause hundreds or thousands of mutations. And also, up to 5% of the existing natural genes in the organism can change their levels of expression when a single gene is inserted.
And as I understand through reading, it makes the gene sequence unstable. Is that correct?
It absolutely can. There is a recombinant hotspot within the promoter, which some people believe can make the genome unstable after the insertion. Also, the process can completely dislocate large sections of genes, putting them even on different chromosomes. The promoter can accidentally switch on other genes down the stream from the inserted gene, causing them to permanently go on. It becomes basically a genetic roulette. It was the concept of the insertion and the promoter and all that, which was the inspiration for the name of my book, Genetic Roulette, because we really do not have a precise technology or understanding of the impacts of this primitive technology.
I was on an airplane a few years ago going to do business, and I sat near a gentleman and his associate. I think they were from GE. And I don't know how we got starting to talk about starving people. I said, I wish that they were not being given genetically modified food because they're going to be sick and die very young. They're going to have problems physically that they never imagined. And he turned to me and he said, how dare you say that about feeding people that don't have food? It's better than nothing. And I really wanted to ask you what your take is with the paradigm that the people that are starving should be, quote, lucky to get genetically modified food, and that's why it's being allowed and empowered to happen in developing nations.
Well, the whole concept that GMOs are needed to feed the world was basically the product of the public relations companies that were hired by Monsanto and the other biotech industry companies. There's no truth to it. In fact, it actually works against feeding a hungry world. Let me explain. The concept that GMOs will feed the world is based on the premise that in order to feed the world, you simply need to increase yield. Now, that premise is false. We know that there's more food per person than any time in human history today, and yet about 1 billion people go to bed hungry or malnourished every day. And that it is not the yield figures which are determining poverty or determining starvation. It's more poverty and distribution of food. But let's pretend for a moment that yield is the answer, which they do. It turns out that the average genetically modified crop reduces yield. They've never genetically modified crops specifically to increase yield. And the very comprehensive report called Failure to Yield by the Union of Concerned Scientists is the most in-depth evaluation of yield figures, and it shows that, for example, genetically modified soy reduces yield by 5 to 10%, canola is down, cotton is down. There's a tiny percentage increase in some cases with a certain type of corn, but it's dwarfed by the increase in yields from natural selective breeding. Now, in addition, if something is to feed the hungry world, it needs to be reliable. It needs to yield in a reliable way so that the farmer doesn't end up impoverished. Now, the process of genetic engineering, as we just discussed, is fraught with unpredicted side effects. And we see that not only in terms of its impacts on health, which we can talk about in great detail soon, but also on its growing conditions, which are the uncertainties are magnified by all the complexity of an ecosystem. And so in India, where Monsanto has pushed its genetically modified cotton plants engineered with a gene that produces an insecticide called Bt to kill the bollworm. It is not reliable. Very often there's traumatic problems with the yield. Sometimes the seeds don't germinate. Sometimes the crops get infested with other pests, or the bolls are smaller, or they have root rot or leaf curl. It turns out that Monsanto has convinced millions of cotton farmers to borrow money to pay for their more expensive genetically modified seeds and associated chemicals. And so many of these farmers are not able to even pay back their loans. Many commit suicide when they're faced with the shame of having to lose the farm that may be in their family for generations. The UK Daily Mail 2 years ago estimated the number of Bt cotton farmers that have committed suicide because of the failure of Bt was an amazing and incredible 125,000. And my friend Vandana Shiva puts the number at closer to 200,000. So this is another reason why GMOs are not designed to feed the world. But it goes on. They're also now taking money away from more appropriate technologies, which can increase yields in an appropriate way and increase biodiversity and the nourishment of the food. We know that from one study with over 12 million farms in 57 countries, they found a 79% increase in yield using sustainable practices. But these are not getting the attention of the money from the Gates Foundation and the U.S. government because they're not the sexy new technology that promotes U.S. interests. In addition, the biotech industry requires that farmers do not save seeds year after year, but invest in new seeds every year so that they can gain the farmer's money. This reduces the independence of the farmer and drastically reduces the biodiversity, which is the basis of food security. So we have a perfect storm working against feeding the world, which has prompted the most comprehensive report in Earth about agriculture called the ISTAT report, which was signed on by 60 countries and had over 400 scientific authors. It concluded that the current generation of GM crops has nothing to offer their goals of feeding the hungry world or eradicating poverty.
Then how come it is that Monsanto is given the green light all over the world? Why?
Well, let's start with the FDA. The FDA in 1992 gave the green light for GM foods to be put on the market. And the policy, which came out at the end of May of 92, claimed that the agency was not aware of any information showing that GM foods were significantly different. And because of that, they said no safety testing whatsoever was required, no labeling was required.